Good afternoon, you guys, and welcome back to the Prime Vanguard channel. Today, I'm going to be featuring to you my take on the Bruce deck profile for Final Rush. Now, besides Bastion being the best deck, I believe that Bruce has become the second most popular deck of the Overdress based off the BSFO results. Bruce has really good attacks, it's got a strong offensive setup, and it has really good resource management for its strategy. Bruce also has a really sick anime opening. I have to admit, that moment did kind of get me shook. I've never seen that from a trading card anime, so if you watch the Vanguard anime and you don't know what I'm talking about, then you know what we're talking about. But for the deck itself, I think that's really strong, it's really amazing, and it's really fast. The Final Rush mechanic, while it is a little bit slow, when it pops off is really amazing. And this is just my take on how I want to do that mechanic and how I decided to take on these choices of cards. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Alright, you guys, so to showcase the ride chain of the deck, I am playing the Trial Deck Bruce variation. Now, this is the Trial Deck variation that came with the Trial Deck. It features Matt, Bruce, Steve, Richard. This variation, I like it the most. Compared to the Electro Spartan variation, it gets you extra soul. I like this variation because it gets you extra soul and it gets you extra draw. And the cool thing about playing Bruce over time that I've just learned is that because this deck does not pop off until later in the game, the soul management is one that you can mess around with because it's not until turn 4 that you really need to meet the requirements for the 5 soul effect. Because there are units in this deck that require us to soul blast that we want to use for later, or getting to the soul that we need is not as hard as it can be, especially over time, because until you reach that final rush turn or that Persona Ride final rush turn, then the amount of soul that you have doesn't really matter as much as long as you can make it for your final turn. And for my main deck, I'm playing 3 copies of Diabolos Violence Bruce. Now, with Bruce being the main grade 3 of the deck, we obviously want to see him as much as possible so that we can Persona Ride when we go into our final rush turn. He also is just an extremely powerful Vanguard, especially for Overdress. I understand that he's pretty much the Shadow Vampire of OD, getting you 2 extra multiple attacks with Soul Blast of 5. But on the Persona Ride, this makes your 2 rearguard attacks a lot stronger and your Vanguard column much better, as extra power that you have to deal with, and this is happening 5 times before trigger effects and so forth. So you want to make sure that you have as many copies of him in the deck as possible so that you can Persona Ride when you go to Final Rush. 4 copies of Upward Acrobat Marjorie. Upward Acrobat Marjorie, without a doubt, is the best card in the deck. She generates you the most resources for free. She gives you a draw, she gives you soul, she gives you additional soul, and she gets power on her own. And the cool thing about this deck is that because it is a multi-attacking deck, she gets to maintain her 10,000 power bonus until the end of the turn. So you're going to use her before you restand her with Bruce, so that this way she keeps her 10,000 power buff as well as the power bonuses and trigger effects that are going to come later. You need to play 4 of this card because this is one of your best defensive units. And in this deck, I have decided to focus more on my offensive cards and making sure that I can always be offensive, whether it be on my first grade 3 turn with Bruce or my final rush turn with Bruce. But this is definitely one of the key cards that does this because it's also one of your best resource management cards as she puts stuff into the soul and gets you extra soul in a card draw. So therefore, you want to max out 4 copies of this card. This definitely is the best offensive unit that you have in the deck. And over everything else, as long as you have 4 copies of this card and Bruce, you should be straight. For my next grade 3, I'm playing 2 copies of the Time-Fissuring Fist Colossus. Now, Bruce is a very offensive deck, but it doesn't pop off until later in the game. And I want to make sure that I have cards that are always going to be able to put me into Final Rush and are always going to be as aggressive as possible. And Time-Fissuring Fist Colossus is just one of those options. This deck has a lot of offensive cards, and there are going to be times where, unfortunately, you do have to choose like which units you want to put in the front row, because obviously you can't expand your front row. You just got your 2 other circles, and 9 times out of 10, it's going to be this card, Marjorie, and then another card I'm going to showcase to you in my grade 2 lineup. But this card is really important as well because unlike the other 2 cards, he can get to 28,000 power immediately. And keep in mind that in Overdress, there are no 10,000 point shields, only 15,000 and 5,000. So this card automatically demands 2 cards at your opponent's hand. And when you combine that with the Persona Riding bonus, as well as any triggering effects later, this card becomes a very devastating powerhouse that in most games does demand a perfect guard from your opponent when you put a critical trigger on it, just because of how much power it acquires by itself. I do want to note that this definitely is the most flexible slot in the deck. I can understand why, because I already play Marjorie, if you don't want to play this card, you don't have to. I'm just playing this because I like having as many options as I possibly can to try and go into Final Rush, so I am playing 2 copies of this, but I can see this card being taken out later for something else. Moving on to my grade 2s, I played 3 copies of Steam Gunner Brody. Brody is a grade 2 10k shield defensive unit, and that's all this card is. Now, a lot of people are going to ask and still wonder why people are still playing this card compared to the other offensive grade 2s that Dark States has, or resource managing grade 2s that they have. But the main reason why people are playing this card is because this is a 10k shielding unit. And remember, something that I've emphasized, especially in my other deck profiles with Overdress, is that there are no 10k shielding cards unless you have a unit that, like this one, has an effect that gets you additional 5,000 point shield. Having that extra 10k shield, especially in a deck that doesn't really pop off until later in the game, is very important because Bruce doesn't counterblast that much at all. That's what I've noticed. Your counterblast really goes only to 1 to 2 cards, and having this extra shield is very important because it makes it so you don't have to guard with extra cards in your hand to create awkward numbers. I really do think that that is very important to note because 10k means that you have to take 2 5ks from your hand, which could be a grade 1 or grade 2, and this card just does that alone by itself. And because we don't care about our counterblast in this deck, it's fine to give that up too for the extra shield. Personally, for me, like I said earlier, I think I would give up one of my Colossuses to make another Brody, and that's where I see this deck going in the future, unless we get better resource management or a way to access Final Rush, or we can explode more on Final Rush. I definitely see Brody being a staple in this deck for a long time, depending on how much faster the other decks get. But for right now, I'm only playing 3 of it simply because, offensively speaking, this deck is just so good that this is just enough for me. But depending on where the other decks go in the future, I could see myself increasing this card to 4. For my next grade 2, I'm playing 4 copies of Diabolos Boys Eden. Now, this is the other offensive card that I was speaking about on my explanation of Marjorie. Diabolos Boys Eden is a really great offensive grade 2 because when it's restood by an effect, it gets 5,000 power plus a critical when you're all in Final Rush. And then he has the second ability where if he attacks something and it hits, whether it be the Vanguard or Recusal, you get to retire a unit. So this card pretty much does everything. It gives you control, power, and critical, and it's a grade 2, which means that it's a 5k intercept. So it's pretty much got everything you'd want in a good offensive card when you drop it onto the board. This is one of the cards that, depending on where you're at in the state of the game, you might play for your Final Rush turn when you do your Persona Ride Final Rush turn. And it's between this and Colossus, but this is always going to be a staple in Bruce just because of how good this is. And where I say this between him and Colossus because Marjorie's always going to be on the board. You always want Marjorie for the extra resources, so that one open circle is going to go to your Colossus and you're going to Eden. I usually go into Colossus when my opponent's already at 4 to 5 damage, and I just need to get extra power to push through. And then I'll go to Eden when my opponent's at 3 damage when I'm about to go into my Persona Ride Final Rush turn. There is a difference when that happens because when you Persona Ride, you're giving 10k to your front row and extra card draw versus just going straight up into Final Rush if you cannot Persona Ride. So that's the difference between the two, because the extra critical does make this card very threatening, and it is something that your opponent has to consider throughout the battle phase, especially when your powers are fluctuating during the battle phase, so nothing ever stays the same over time. And now for my grade 1s, I'm playing 3 copies of Protobulb Dragon. At first, I did not like this card. I didn't really understand the point of it because we are going to Soul Blast later, and I just thought it was just another way of soul charging. But over time, this card is actually really impressive. So Protobulb Dragon, for those of you that don't know what it does, it's a when it attacks or boosts, you get to counterblast 1. If you're in Final Rush, put something into the soul and take something out of the soul. So this card pretty much lets you filter cards from out your soul. Over time, you're going to be going through your deck and soul charging with your other soul charging skills, or you're going to have abilities that's going to move your rear guards into the soul, like this one. And being able to get those cards back from the soul is going to be very important before you lose them to the drop zone. For my next grade 1, I'm playing 3 copies of Acrobat Presenter. So Acrobatic Presenter is our main soul charging engine of the deck. This card, when you're in Final Rush, will give you a soul charge of 2, but anytime prior to that will give you just a soul charge of 1, as long as your Vanguard is Diabolos Bruce. So this card is unfortunately also like a way of decking out, because unlike other boosters, this one is mandatory. You have to soul charge. If you are in Final Rush, you have to soul charge too. But it's easy to deal with because we have cards like Marjorie or Protobulb Dragon who will move this card into the soul, and we can filter out for something else or something better that we want later. And we really just need this card in the early game to help us set up for our soul charging if we don't have other key cards that allow us to do that, or maintain the soul when we go to our Final Rush turn. For my next grade 1, I'm playing 4 copies of Recusal Hate Dragon. Recusal Hate Dragon is the Sentinel for Dark States, with its new ability to prevent you from discarding as much as your hand when you're low on it. Makes it extremely good and better than the old one that you have. And for my last grade 1 and my favorite of the deck, I'm playing 4 copies of Steam Battler. Now, Steam Battler Gungnram has become one of my favorite units of the deck because over time, after just playing Bruce and playing against other people and watching videos, I now understand the value of this card. The value of this card is that in the early game, this card lets you fight back, but it also lets you get an extra card draw. See, Bruce doesn't pop off until turn 4 or until you persona right into it, and even then you have a lot of skills that will generate you a lot of soul and other bonuses from their soul charging effects on turn 3. So earlier in the game, or in the middle of the game, you can use this card's ability maybe once or twice to get an extra card draw and extra resources. And that's very helpful in a deck like this, where you're trying to assemble all your pieces as best as you can and putting rear guards from the field into the soul to generate as much board presence as possible to create the perfect formation for when you go into Final Rush. Because once you have that set up and you persona ride and you've got your Marjorie here, you're eating your Colossus here, and your other pieces just in the back row ready to boost, then your Final Rush turns become extremely terrifying to your opponent. And this card being able to give us the early game pressure as well as the resource management to do that is extremely amazing. And that's why it's become one of my favorite grade 1s for the deck. Moving on to my triggers, I play 7 critical, which is 4 copies of Diabolos Girl Maimai and 3 copies of Flinty Slasher. 7 critical is good enough for this deck. I do want to play more draw triggers, as you're going to see later, because I do need to go through this deck and filter out for key pieces. That's something that's very important in Overdress, is that there are only so many good cards right now, and you really want to make sure that you can pull all those good cards, which is why you're going to see more draw triggers in a lot of other decks, especially in the higher level up. Otherwise, you're going to be playing more criticals in that case if you want to. But I'm just playing this because I already have Brody for the extra defense. I play more draws, go through my deck, and I just need criticals to make sure that my offensive multiple attacks are relevant. As I stated prior, I am playing 4 draw triggers, which is Diabolos Boy Jake. Like I was stating with my explanation of the draw triggers on the criticals, draw triggers are important in this deck still because I do want to go through my deck and filter out for key pieces and get more of the better cards to my hand. The 5,000 shield doesn't really matter as much because this card sometimes becomes a target for cards like my Marjorie and stuff like that to put back into the soul and get out, just so I can soul blast it later. But again, you really want to see your key pieces because when you go into Final Rush turn, you really just want to make sure you have everything set up so you only have to worry about planning out your attacks correctly for your opponent. Finally, we have 4 copies of Diabolos Girls. The over trigger for this deck is the Springing King of Determination Olbaria. Now, let me make something very clear. In all of my other deck profiles up to this one, I've been playing the nation-based over trigger for the decks, but the reason why I'm playing the Acrylic Elemental one in this is because since Bruce can generate multiple attacks, and not like Bastion, Bruce can generate 2 more multiple attacks just off the bat, you have cards that gain additional critical and extra power on their own. And being able to give 100 million to those 2 units means that if your opponent's at 3 to 4 damage, those 2 attacks now demand a perfect guard, because there's no way that you're going to be able to guard 200 million attacks with just any amount of cards in your hand. It's not possible. You would have to use almost all of your entire deck to do that, or have your entire trigger lineup in hand to do that, which is just, that's never going to happen. That's the game has to be going in a bad state for you just for that even to happen. So having this card to give me those 2 final attacks after my first wave of 3 attacks to make these almost impossible to guard is actually extremely helpful and amazing too. I was playing the Dark States over trigger. I do have it. I just didn't like it for this deck because, I mean, yes, giving Bruce the permanent critical is cool, and it means that my Vanguard attack will always be important for my opponent to stop, but this card just says you have to perfect guard these, otherwise you lose. Now, what are my final thoughts on Bruce? I definitely see how Bruce can check Bastion, and I really do see why this is one of the second most popular decks, or the second best deck in the meta, as people are calling it, because in the early game, it has all the cards it needs to make sure it can defensively keep up with any early game decks that give it pressure. But its late game is where the deck really shines and pops off. And even if you don't Persona Ride, you're still generating 5 attacks, which is something that most decks in Overdress at the moment cannot do right now. Most decks are only doing 3 to 4 attacks, unless you're Bastion, where you can do potential of 4 to 5 attacks. You just need another card to do it. And with all this resource management the deck has, the drawing, the soul charging, the additional critical, and just the design of the units and their natural way of being offensive, I definitely see how this deck can overcome all the other challenges the other decks have. And because you have so much resource management and just good offensive pressure, especially in the late game, this deck has a really good future. I can see this deck being a top tier deck like for a long time, especially as we get more Dark State support. There are some issues in here that, you know, just need to be fixed, but other than that, this deck is solid. I wouldn't make too many more changes to the deck. Just adding Brody's and any other resource management card they might add us to the future, but that'd be it. Alright, you guys, and that is it for today's deck profile. Please go ahead and tell me what your thoughts are in the comments section below. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Also, share this video to your friends if they're thinking about building a Bruce deck. This is just my take on Bruce and how I wanted to build it from my own personal experiences. That'll be all for today, y'all. See you later.